Okay, guys, we are doing Chapter 8, Part 2 material. This is going to be more the lecture-based stuff that may be on a video or whatnot, or things that have been on previous semesters and are in his test bank and he might have on the exam and stuff like that. Some of these things he's going to talk about, or they might be little blurbs in the study guide that you need to know. This material, you need to just listen to me a couple of times, write down things. Now, in a couple of these pages in the orange packet, like the Great Strike of 77 on the very first page, Pullman Strike, stuff like that, some of the notes are already there. So you have some of that stuff. Some of it we've already gone over in Part 1. We're just going to go over it a little bit more in terms of the material. But otherwise, we are going to finish up Chapter 8. Then we'll go over some of the questions in the back of the study guide. In fact, I think I might be able to have another study guide from previous semesters. I have a couple of questions I can read to you if I don't do it in the live Q&A. All right. These are things that are either in the study guide as little blurbs that have been on the exam before, or things that you might need to know that you talked about in lecture, and just in case there is a question on that. The first thing is there's a few strikes that we had. We had the Pullman Strike. We had the Great Strike of 1877. The Great Strike of 1877, I wrote ahead. I wrote a paragraph on, or a half a page on, in the orange packet. I would read over that. I think that is extremely self-explanatory. The Pullman Strike has quite a bit of stuff there too. But I want to make sure that we know that the workers that went on strike in sympathy for the American Railway workers, the American Railway workers went on a sympathy strike. Someone went on strike, and the American Railway workers went on sympathy strike on behalf of them. By doing so, the mail, U.S. mail, was not put on the railroad cars because that was the American Railway workers supposed to be doing that. They were striking, so the U.S. Army had to intervene and put the mail on the railroad cars. Now, they didn't have to do any military intervention, as in like with actual, assault rifles and stuff like that. They just intervened and put mail on the U.S. mail on the cars that the American Railway workers weren't going to do. So the U.S. Army had to intervene because of a sympathy strike by the American Railway workers for the Pullman Strike. The other material will be on that same page with the Great Strike of 1877 on that front page right after the cover page and the 10 questions in the packet. Okay? Then we have the Homestead Steel Strike. The Homestead Steel Strike has a little blurb in the study guide, but this is Andrew Carnegie's company, and Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steel Company hired Pinkerton Guards. The Pinkerton Guards were just there generally to protect the factories. The managers hired them, and they ended up, while protecting the factories, ended up killing some of the workers. Well, I guess as an incentive towards coming back to work in this strike is if you're going to be threatened with death, either unintentionally or not, you might come back to work. But that was a Homestead Steel Strike. Then you had the Haymarket Riots, and he'll ask you where these Haymarket Riots occurred, and that's in Illinois, Chicago, Illinois to be precise. But if he asks you what state, remember Chicago is not a state. Chicago is a city within the state of Illinois, so you need to note that for the test. Okay? In the Haymarket Riots in Chicago, workers went on strike. The police were brought in to kind of quell the strike, and a bomb was thrown at police, killing 7. Okay? Later on, these 7 that the bomb was thrown at, they ended up having some issues associated to them. But the Haymarket Riots, Chicago, Illinois, a bomb was thrown at the police, killing 7. I would note that for the test as well. Then you have the International Workers of the World. What are the International Workers of the World? These were also known as Wobbies. Wobbies were people basically that brought this idea of social unionism to the United States. These people designated themselves with like wearing red sashes, and they were known as Wobbies, or International Workers of the World. They promoted the idea of social unionization. Social unionization was widespreadly popular in Europe, but it didn't catch on in the United States. We do tend to be more of a business unionism. And you will need to know for test purposes the difference between social unionism and business unionism and how that applies with the International Workers of the World. So the International Workers of the World, also known as Wobbies, they designated by wearing red sashes to distinguish themselves, promoted this social unionization where there is no real classification of unionization, everybody was going to be treated equally, workers would be treated equally, similar to what they wanted to do in Europe. This was popular in Europe, but when it was brought over to America by the international workers of the world, it didn't fly. Business unionism, where we have a discrepancy, or we have a class area of skilled and unskilled labor. You have the AFL, you have the CIO, so you have a definite skilled versus unskilled labor, whereas social unionism, everybody was going to be all in the same group. We did more of a tend to do a business unionization, where the business unionization differentiates between skilled and unskilled labor. Now, based upon that situation, you need to understand in a business unionism setting, how will a situation occur? How will it affect skilled versus unskilled labor? So if it gives you a storyline, make sure you understand that if the storyline was going to hurt unskilled labor, meaning you're going to have to hire 4 or 5 unskilled labor and you'd rather just hire 1 skilled labor, then it's going to help skilled labor get higher prices, but it's going to tend to create unemployment at the unskilled labor job. If the job becomes too cheap, you can get it from unskilled labor and you don't need the skilled labor as much. So understand when we have business unionism and how that applies, okay? Another thing, and we alluded to this with the Taft-Hartley Act, also known as the Labor Management Relations Act, if we go back through that formal and informal name, we talked about the presidential veto. Truman was a huge fan of the labor side. Truman believed that on the labor side, we wanted to do whatever we could, and we wanted to make any laws associated to it. Well, if you think about it, the Taft-Hartley Act was going anti-union. It was because of a series of strikes, series of waves, public was dissatisfied. We had balanced the power from employer to unions, and now unions had all the power. We wanted to make it more even-handed. Well, Truman, being a huge fan of the labor side, didn't like the Taft-Hartley Agreement. Slave Labor Act is its nickname. So Truman vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act. Now remember, an act is a statutory law created by Congress. So the Labor Management Relations Act, Taft-Hartley Act, is a law passed by Congress. Well, Truman refused to sign it and had a presidential veto. And if you remember from exam 1, how do we overturn a presidential veto? It's not a simple majority. Now you need 2/3 of the majority of both houses, but you can override a presidential veto. And this is exactly what they did when it came to the Taft-Hartley or Labor Management Relations Act. They overrode President Truman's veto. So in terms of a lot of things, President Truman has a few things, and this is more for comprehensive final, but remember, Youngstown Steel and Tube versus Sawyer on your first exam had the idea of the seizure of the mill was found illegal. He integrated the military in 1948, and now you have a presidential veto of Taft-Hartley that was overridden by Congress. All right. Another thing that we talked about, we already talked about the Immigration Act of 1924, used to curtail immigration, which favored American workers by simply lessening the competition level because the immigrants weren't able to increase the competition level. This targeted a move towards unionism, although not official, and it helped also separate the classes, but it would have helped with the unskilled labor more than the skilled labor in that AFL-CIO situation of skilled versus unskilled labor. Now, the next 3 or 4 that I'm going to go over are things that may not be on this exam at all. He may not talk about it in the video, but he has had it in the past before. He's had questions on it before. And therefore, if he just hits a random generated test, which I think he's going to be a little bit more customized for this exam, especially being online. But if he wanted to randomize it, there are questions in his test bank that you need to know. One case is a common law case is ILA, International Labor Association versus Jacksonville Bolt Corporation. Now, this case basically decided what is and what is not a labor dispute for under the Wagner Act. What classifies itself as a labor dispute? And what had happened is workers on a cargo ship bound for Russia back during the Cold War refused to put goods onto this cargo ship bound for Russia because of the political agenda. They had political reasons. They did not want to ship these goods to Russia during the Cold War. And by them doing so, a labor stoppage occurred. This helped define what is and what is not a labor dispute. So if he asks you a question about what case law defined what is and what is not a labor dispute under the law, That would be the ILA versus Jacksonville Bolt. Now, this is a previous many semesters ago. I don't know if he's talked about it. The old study guide previous to this one had a little blurb about it. I haven't seen this blurb over time since then. The next one is national peril. And we talked about this under the Taft-Hartley Act, where the president has a right to intervene in labor disputes depending on if the president feels it's necessary for the United States to survive, similar to what Trump might have to do in terms of national peril during the coronavirus or something like that. But in terms of the national peril, a president may intervene in a labor dispute and cause the whatever action to continue to do it, and then they can fight or argue more or negotiate more, but they're going to continue to do the job. Some examples he's had previously is Jimmy Carter, President Carter in the coal industry, Ronald Reagan with the air traffic controllers and the strike with air traffic controllers did. He felt it was a necessary peril to keep them going. Clinton had an argument or extended the period for American Airlines pilots when they were negotiating. Bush Sr. and Nixon both dealt with longshoremen, those that work on the docks and stuff like that. And Eisenhower intervened in the steel industry, in strikes with the steel industry. So questions that could come about. Once again, he usually doesn't talk about these. I think he did a couple of semesters ago, and everybody was like, oh yeah, I remember him saying that. Otherwise, it's been like, when did he ever talk about this? But he has had a question that says, which of the following strikes was presidential intervention occur? And it'll just give you something, about, the Clinton and the American Airlines pilots or Carter and the coal industry. And you basically have to figure out which one is incorrect. So I'm going to go over these one more time just in case. And then the other little question I've heard about, we're going to preface it. So Carter intervened in the coal industry. Ronald Reagan intervened in the air traffic controllers. Clinton intervened with the American Airlines pilot strike. Bush Sr. and Nixon both intervened with longshoremen, those that work on the docks. And Eisenhower did with the steel industry as well. Now, one of the questions I heard was, all of the above was the answer, or could have been one of the answers. And it's like, oh, okay, well, all these were presidential interventions, so people picked all of the above. Well, the interesting aspect of the question that someone said is, the reason they missed it was said, which Democratic president intervened? And now all of a sudden we go through Carter, Reagan, Clinton, Bush Sr., Nixon, Eisenhower, and you have to figure out which one was a Democratic president. Well, Jimmy Carter was a Democratic president. Clinton was a Democratic president for sure. Reagan, Bush Sr., and Nixon, although many people don't, and Reagan were Reagan, Bush Sr., Nixon were all definitely Republicans. So note that in case that question comes about. Make sure you know the national peril interventions, coordinate them with the president, and then you might want to know which one's Democrat, which one's Republican, just in case you get that question, although it's kind of a cheesy question. All right. Another case that came about is the National Labor Relations Board versus Babcock. And this case was a case about basically the certification process of scheduling a certification for union activity. And when union leaders can come on site to interact with prospective union members and discuss the pros and cons of union membership and how it relates to helping them with filing grievances or getting more wages or safer working conditions or whatnot. And what the NLRB versus Babcock case did was said non-employees could come on site and not affect, as long as they didn't affect productivity, they could act in the best interest of the employees by giving them the pros and cons to labor union certification, whether they're going to vote for or against the labor union. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about this when we talk about the certification process. Just understand there's a little time in which union leaders can come on site as long as they don't affect productivity. If they affect productivity, obviously there's going to be a problem and they can be dismissed from the site. The other thing that we need to talk about, once again, is the Ally Doctrine. I talked about this briefly and said this was an exception under Taft-Hartley for secondary boycotts. Remember, secondary boycotts is where a primary strike occurs at the main site, but it's not working, so they get their friends to strike, or they picket at one of the companies' retailers. So Bluebell would go and have a strike or picket, or get their friends to strike at Kroger or HEB. And if they strike, now HEB or Kroger has to get involved and intervene in the labor dispute between Bluebell and its employees because it's interrupting their business. So what they're going to do, Kroger and HEB would then go to the Bluebell and say, look, I don't care how you handle this, but if you don't get this rectified, if we have strikes and we have pickets in front of our store because we sell Bluebell ice cream, we can eliminate that by just stopping to sell Bluebell in our stores. Well, if Bluebell loses all its customers, then they'll probably go back to the bargaining table. And that's what the Allied Doctrine was, that is a secondary boycott. Now, the Allied Doctrine says to do that would be an illegal activity. That's what the secondary boycott is. That is an illegal activity. But what an Allied Doctrine says is, if that were to occur, there is one exception when it would be permitted under Taft-Hartley. And that is when, say, a company hires replacement workers. And while the other company is picketing on something like that, they decide they also want to picket against the company that was hired. Maybe maybe Bluebell hired an entire company to take over the workforce. They can also go and picket at that company as well, and it wouldn't be against the law. It would be an exception under secondary boycotts. So I would read out if you're having problems with secondary boycotts, text me, email me, or look up secondary boycotts in terms of maybe get some more examples. I'll try to do it if we do a Q&A, because that one's the one that has a lot more trouble for a lot of people. Now, that said, one of the basic easier questions is, if it gives you secondary boycott, is this legal or illegal? It is going to be illegal under Taft-Hartley or Labor Management Relations Act. Is it always illegal? No, because you do have the exception of the Allied Doctrine. Okay, those are going to be right there, are some of the lecture-based material that is not really discussed as much in the study guide, or it may be something that he goes over or doesn't go over, and we kind of did a little more extra information that you need to know. All that extra information, talking to students from previous semesters, has been helpful for them to be able to at least distinguish between answers on the exam. Now, going back over the study guide in Chapter 8, we have a few other things that we need to go over in terms of just material. All right, when it comes to unionization, the public sector, i.e. the government sector, is much more highly unionized than the private sector, i.e. just private businesses. The public or governmental sector is about 38% union, okay? And the private sector is only about 8% union. Now, there are pockets like New York City, Chicago, where it's heavily unionized and they have a large number of people. But basically, the private sector only accounts for about 8% of the total union, or only 8% of the people are unionized within the private sector, i.e. private businesses. Whereas the government or public sector is much more unionized at around 38%. That's on page 233 of your study guide. All right, on page 234 of your study guide, at the top, it talks about American socialism being not very successful. That would be the International Workers of the World, WABI, social unionization, widespreadly in Europe, didn't work. We went for more of a business unionization. And then towards the top, 4B1 on page 234, talks about the Haymarket Square strike and the Pullman strike. You also had the Homestead Steel strike that we talked about in the study when we did all those notes as well earlier on that you need to know. Okay. Let's see, the AFL, Samuel Gompers, dealt with more skilled labor, and CIOs more unskilled labor. That's in the middle of page 234 of your study guide as well, so you need to note that. The other thing is you need to know that 30% of the workforce was out of a job during the Great Depression, that New Deal era, okay? So note that. Now on page 235, it begins with those 4 major acts with Norris LaGuardia kind of mid-top of page 235. So we've already done most all of this stuff with the Wagner Act, Norris LaGuardia, Taft-Hartley, and Landry-Griffin. Remember, the Norris LaGuardia is the Federal Anti-Injunction Act. Wagner is the National Labor Relations Act. Taft-Hartley, the Labor Management Relations Act. and Landry and Rippon, the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosures Act, formal and informal name. However, we do need to go over a few things that are found in the study guide that we didn't already talk about in part 1 or didn't already list, but we need to go over them just briefly. One of them is who is, and who is not under Wagner. And that's on page 235, 236, and part of 237 probably, in terms of who is and who is not an employee under Wagner. The first thing is Wagner does not include governmental workers, whether it's state, local, federal. It excludes virtually all government employees. They are not unionized under the Wagner Act. So governmental workers do not fall under Wagner or the jurisdiction of Wagner. Airline employees, railroad employees do not fall under Wagner as well, because the Railway Labor Act deals with this, and airlines fall under the Railway Labor Act. So if you're given a storyline in which it's a government worker, whether it's state, federal, or local, or it's dealing with a railroad or an airline employee, the first thing you need to think about is Wagner doesn't necessarily apply. Now, some of the ideas behind Wagner could apply, but Wagner itself doesn't apply. Now, also domestic servants, that would be maids, butlers, chauffeurs, they don't fall under there as well. Supervisors don't fall under that. And that's anybody that hires, suspends, lays off, recalls, promotions, discharge, anybody like that. Supervisors generally are not falling under Wagner as well. Agricultural laborers do not fall under Wagner as well. Individuals employed by family, i.e. a parent or a spouse, do not fall under Wagner. So if the Duggars, all 19 kids and counting, if they may even have more, if they all decide to unionize against their parents, if they had a family-owned business, that would be fine. They could unionize, but they wouldn't fall under Wagner. That is important as a side note for your next, well, for now, probably exam 4, because of child labor laws, okay? Independent contractors, FedEx drivers or something like that, do not fall under Wagner as well. That would be an Uber. If you had an Uber question, Uber would be an independent contractor. They would not fall under Wagner as well. So who doesn't fall under Wagner once again? Virtually any government employee, state, federal, or local, airline employees, railroad employees, people who work for their parents or spouse, i.e. family, agricultural laborers, domestic servants like butlers, chauffeurs, maids, stuff like that, supervisors, and independent contractors. Note all of those and be ready for a test question, possibly using a storyline, and then you need to understand that the multiple choice based upon the answer may be Wagner doesn't apply because they are under one of those exclusions. All right, on 8A2 at the very bottom of page 236 of your study guide, 8A2 under Wagner makes it unlawful for the employer to dominate or interfere with the formation or administration of a labor organization. 8A2 makes it unlawful for an employer to dominate or interfere with the formation or administration of a labor organization. So let's think about that for a while. Even though Norris LaGuardia specifically outlawed yellow dog contracts, wouldn't a yellow dog contract be something that would be allow an employer to dominate or interfere with the formation or administration of a labor organization? I would argue yes. So yellow dog contracts are not only illegal and outlawed under Norris LaGuardia, but they would also technically be outlawed or illegal under Wagner. Now, ask yourself this question. Is SWIM trying to trick you too much, or are you reading too much into the question? But think about this way. If you're given a question and the only answers are A, B, C, D, and E, and it doesn't have an A and B but not C, C and A but not B, and you can only pick one, anything dealing with yellow dog contracts, the answer is more than likely going to be Federal Anti-Injunction Act or Norris LaGuardia, formal or informal name. Okay? But if he gives you a situation and says, not specifically outlaws, but says, where would a yellow dog contract be illegal? Norris LaGuardia, Federal Anti-Injunction is definitely your answer for one of them. But you might have to also preface it by saying, remember, 8A2 says the employer cannot interfere or dominate with the creation of a labor organization. And a yellow dog contract would do just that. So technically, yellow dog contracts would also be a violation of Section 8A2 of Wagner, and you need to be able to make sure you note that for the test as well. All right. On page 237 of your study guide, it has the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board, the appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate. It's usually a 5-member panel. And remember, that's going to be independent because it ends in board. It's going to be economy-wide because it deals with all labor management negotiations over the course of many different industries. And it was created during the New Deal era in 1935 with the passing of the Wagner Act. So the NLRB was created by the NLRA, National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act or the Magna Carta of Labor. All right. And at the very bottom of page 237, it talks about Section 8, unfair labor practices by an employer. We talk about anything that is going to stop them from forming labor unions or engaging collective bargaining would be a violation there. All right. What do you collectively bargain? On page 238 of your study guide towards the bottom, it says what can you and can you not collectively bargain. Now, if an employer refuses to bargain collectively or doesn't bargain in good faith collectively with the union, then that is a Section 8 violation of Wagner, okay? Because there's good faith bargaining on wages, hours, and other conditions of employment. And other conditions of employment can be broad spectrum. Wages could include profit sharing, all forms of compensation, whether it be bonuses, whether it be your salary, whether it be retirement benefits, pension plans, stock options, profit sharing, all that stuff. Hours could be your seniority, could be grievance procedures and disciplinary measures. It could be workloads and how much workload. And then other conditions of employment is very broad going. How much production levels are we going to require? If we use subcontractors, are we going to be allowed to do that? That's going to be something to be negotiated with the unions. The union status within the company going to be negotiated. If you want to close down a plant, probably has to be negotiated. The day-to-day activities don't have to be negotiated, but a lot of things fall under other conditions of employment. It's a broad spectrum that falls under there. All right. The next thing we need to talk about is on page 239 of your study guide, and that is the election of a labor union itself. We're talking about the certification and or potential decertification of a labor union and how the process goes about. The first step in creating a labor union by election, is to collect signed authorization cards. You sign authorization cards of everybody within a bargaining unit. So say you have 150 employees. You're going to go to all 150 employees and you're going to get them to sign authorization cards saying you want to try to promote a labor union. You want to schedule an election. If 30% or more sign those authorization cards, you have completed step 1. If less than 30 do it, the process ends right there, and then you're going to have to start all over again at another time. Usually you have to wait a little while. But if you get 30%, which is the exact same time, the same percentage as the unemployment rate during the Great Depression, in case you need to note that for test purposes as well. So you get all that. Everybody within the bargaining unit, the whole business and stuff like that, divisions of the business, whatever it is, they're going to have to sign those authorization cards. If 30% or more sign, you move on to the next step. The next step is to schedule an election with the NLRB. The National Labor Relations Board schedules an election. You petition the NLRB to schedule an election. Okay? Now, once that scheduled election exists, then you're going to have some downtime. And in the downtime, this is more the old professor, but Swin still alludes to it as well. In that downtime, union members can come on site, as long as they don't affect productivity in LRB versus Babcock, and talk about the pros and cons, mainly the pros, of why a labor union should be formed. And then the employer can say, hey, this is what's going to happen if you unionize. This is what likely happens to businesses when you unionize. As long as they don't threaten anybody with the loss of their jobs, don't threaten them with force, or if they don't promise them benefit, and as long as they're not being dishonest with them, the employer can say certain things about how it's going to negatively impact their business. Whereas the union leaders can come on, as long as they don't affect productivity, and talk about the pros to it. Okay? Then the NLRB schedules an election. This election is going to be by secret ballot. All the people within the bargaining unit, whether you voted or whether you signed authorization cards or not, everybody votes by secret ballot. If a majority rule, 50% plus one, agree, then the union is certified, and they'll get certification. They'll be able to collectively bargain with them and the employer. If you don't get 50% and you don't reach that majority plus one, then the process ends and you have to start it up at a later date and go through the whole thing all over again. But if you do meet that 50% plus one, and remember, secret ballot, that's usually a multiple choice option. You need to know it makes D slightly better answer than, say, C in the multiple choice. And then when you're going between B and C, you can at least say, okay, C's better, so I'm going to go with C. All right. So we scheduled the secret ballot election. We have certification. Once certification occurs, then they have the right to collectively bargain. That is one of the things under Wagner, that the union has a right to collectively bargain, and the employer under Wagner must bargain in good faith. Wages, hours, other conditions of employment, all that stuff. When they do that, they will create a collective bargaining agreement. Now, typically, a collective bargaining agreement is going to last for a period of about 3 years. Within that 3-year time period, you typically cannot have a strike exist. The employees cannot, the union cannot strike for economic purposes. Now, once that 3 years is ended, they can go after an economic strike. Now, if it is an unfair labor practice by the employer, then they can strike immediately. Now, what are the options when a strike occurs by the unions for the employer? The employer, regardless if it's an unfair labor practice strike or a union or an economic strike, the employer can hire replacement workers or scabs to take over the business so their business can continue to run. So if all the Bluebell workers go out on strike and none of them do, and they picket or whatever, if they go on strike, Bluebell could hire replacement workers, also known as scabs, and those people can get their job during that economic time period. Now, what happens when the strike is over in this situation? Well, typically, once again, remember, an economic strike cannot happen during the collective bargaining agreement, so we generally don't have a collective bargaining agreement in place with an economic strike. So once the strike is over, the employer can keep on any replacement worker they want, and the other people don't necessarily get their jobs back right away. They don't get them back. They can keep on the replacement workers until they leave and or they want to see fit, and then and only then could some of those union workers get their jobs back because it was an economic strike. Now, an unfair labor practice strike, once the unfair labor practice strike is over, those union workers are, and I'm not going to use the word required, are eligible and should be getting their job back almost immediately. That doesn't mean you have to get rid of all the replacement workers. The employer might like some of those replacement workers and keep them on, but they must give their job back to them if it's an unfair labor practice strike. And typically an unfair labor practice strike could occur during the collective bargaining agreement, but a no strike clause usually agrees to a no strike clause during the collective bargaining agreement, and therefore they can't do it unless it's something really pretty bad. Economics doesn't apply. All right. And that right to strike is on page 240, also the bottom of page 239, and the top of page 240 where it talks about right to strike. I think we've done pretty much everything else in the study guide. We've gone over most of the little itty bitty things in here. We went over in depth Taft-Hartley and Landrum Griffin, so we've got all that stuff as well. Let's see. Yeah, I think we've got pretty much everything from there. So let's go over some of the questions in the back of chapter 8 to see which ones are good. Number 2 is good. Which labor law was passed by Congress over presidential veto? And it gives you, if you notice, A is an informal name, B is an informal name, C, D, and E are all the formal names, so it's combined together. The answer is Taft-Hartley. It's not there, but the Labor Management Relations Act, D, is there. Okay? Labor law that prohibits management from obtaining injunctions against labor disputes. That was Norris LaGuardia, or the Anti-Injunction Act, so it's A and B. We have the formal name and the informal name, although it should be the Federal Anti-Injunction Act, but nevertheless, A and B would be correct for number 3. Number 13 is a pretty good one. Number 11 is a pretty good one on page 249 of your study guide. Number 10 on the bottom of page 248 is pretty good. And number 17 is a pretty decent one as well. If you notice that most of those questions right there dealt with which of the four major acts, formal and informal name and stuff like that as well apply. Now, I'm going to look and I'm going to see if I have in front of me some of the old study guide questions. And if I don't, I will look through the paper, and then if we have a Q&A session, live Q&A session, say on Monday or Tuesday or something like that, that we will be able to go through it and go through some of those questions as well. So yeah, if I find them, I will, there's some other questions that he's had previously that are more storyline scenario-based questions. If I find those, we'll do a Q&A, or I'll set up another little 10-minute video with some of the better stuff if we can't do a Q&A live. All right, that ends chapter 8. The next thing I'll be doing is probably the video for chapter 9, business entities. We will be using that chart on the back of the chart that the labor union or the four major labor acts was on. And basically chapter 9 is filling in that chart completely, utterly filling it in, and then going over a couple little things in the study guide. But for chapter 9, that chart, which is this chart right here in your packet, on the back of that one, I don't know if you can see this, sorry, might be a little blurry. On the back of the one that we just filled in part 1, that is entirely chapter 9. If we fill in this, we pretty much have everything that we need for chapter 9. That'll be in the next video. Thank you.